and we have brilliant speakers, and we are talking about wilder weather in this session, and we have other brilliant sessions after this and tomorrow, so do come to those. We're looking at the wilder weather that we have seen, and are our farmers and farms future-proofed. Just thinking of a few statistics that are, available to us. We all know, we've seen the flooding in farms over the last. I should have mentioned who I am. I'm Vicki Hird, Strategic Lead on Agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts, and I'll introduce the speakers in a minute. But just to sort of give a bit of background to where we are, the unprecedented wet weather over the last year means production of major crops in the UK are thought to be down up to a fifth this year. This will have huge implications for our food security. The wheat harvest was expected to be down 26.5%. That's feed crops, bread crops, energy crops, everything. And it's not the first time we've had extremes, obviously. The record-breaking temperatures in 2018 saw the yields of onions, carrots, and potatoes dropped dramatically. And it's just going to get more frequent. So we need to be thinking about this, we need to be talking about this, and we need to have the policies and the response from the industry to actually future-proof our farms. And that's going to need support from eaters. I don't like to call people consumers to eaters, but the government, the industry beyond the farm gate, all matters. But we're here to talk with some brilliant people today. So we've got Joe Stanley, who's a farmer. I'll let them introduce themselves in more detail, but also a brilliant columnist for Farmers Weekly and elsewhere. Joanna Lewis, who's the CEO of Wiltshire Wildlife Trusts. Oh my God, my brain's gone. Neil, I'm having the heat stroke here, and sorry about that. Who's a environmental advisor and expert, is that right? And Guy Singh-Watson, founder of Riverford organic schemes. So they will introduce their approach to farming, their farming, and where they see those wilder weathers impacting on their farming and farming around them. I'll give them a couple of minutes, and then we'll have some discussions around some key areas, and there will be time for you to ask questions at the end, not at the end. And we will be filming this, so we'll ask you to use a microphone when you speak, and it will be sent almost live in about an hour, so it is live, and then it'll be on our YouTube afterwards. So a lot of people watch it later, so it's a great way to reach wider audiences. So Joe, tell me about how you're experiencing wilder weather on your farm.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, it's going to be so good you can watch it back immediately after the event. As a farmer, for me, essentially the weather has dropped off a cliff since 2018. Is how I always try to describe it. So farmers, certainly in this country, nice temperate island country, you have always been able to rely on the weather doing more or less what you want it to do at more or less the right time of year. And really since 2018 that has ceased to be the case. So as a farmer, first of all, it really felt from that really hot, long, dry summer and spring of 2018 every season seemed to start to become extreme. And now it seems to be every month is setting new records, hottest, driest, wettest, mildest. And this is hugely problematic. Vicky's already sort of given those top line figures around agricultural production. The Allerton project, research and demonstration farm in Leicestershire, where I'm currently working, we research sustainable farming solutions. We've been doing regenerative farming for at least a decade, lots of resilience measures. And we've got 40% of our farm completely uncropped this year. We have no crops whatsoever planted on it because of the weather. So that's the sort of impact that we're starting to see as farmers, and it's untenable, essentially. We cannot continue to farm the way that we're farming, and I'm sure we'll come back to that as we go through.
Thank you, Joe. Joanna, you work with farmers at the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, and you also have land yourself, so how are you experiencing?
That's right. So Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, we have our own farm hubs, which effectively enable conservation grazing services across our farms. But we also engage a lot with farmer clusters across Wiltshire, because our vision for nature recovery is it is 30 by 30, 30% of land well managed for nature by 2030, but in the context of restoring species abundance right across the county. And farmers have to be in the driving seat of that. We engage with farmers in terms of development of nature-based projects for biodiversity net gain. We have a river restoration team who do fantastic work with farmers. But I'm here obviously also representing the Wildlife Trust Federation as a whole. We're very lucky to have, as our Director of Climate Change and Evidence in the Wildlife Trust movement, Catherine Brown, who used to be the head of adaptation for the Climate Change Committee. And she's supported the Wildlife Trust movement to do a new hazard assessment, which is looking at what is the impact going to be of extremes of climate across our reserves. And even with a 2-degree warming trajectory, which as we know is conservative, at least half our reserves are going to be at risk of extreme wildfire events. And again, another half of our reserves are going to be very affected by an increase in low flow periods in rivers. Now in Wiltshire, our chalk streams are internationally important. They are our Great Barrier Reef, if you like, our Okavango Delta. So it's incredibly important that we work with farmers along the banks. We're leading a landscape recovery project with the Wiley Valley Farmer Cluster and the Environmental Farmers Group, which I can say a little bit more about as well. But in the absence of the Climate Change Committee too, when we come to questions, I might say a few things about perhaps where adaptation has fallen down in the policy debate as well.
That would be great. Thank you very much, and for talking about Catherine's work and that hazard assessment, which is actually really alarming. You know, we often talk when we think about farming, the flooding and the drought, but wildfires are going to affect everything, including farming. So, yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. Niels Corfield, I'm so sorry. I didn't get your surname in my head at the right time. Please tell us your experience as an advisor and an expert of, in the farming and restoration of nature. Where you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So part of my work, as well as sort of advising and training, is to go on farm and do monitoring work, so direct monitoring of soils using spade tests and infiltration rate tests, for example. And I've now monitored well over 200 farms right across the UK. So I can now say that I'm firmly convinced that poor soil health is probably one of the main driving factors. And that is essentially sort of acting as a significant drag on productivity, and it's leading to sort of land lying wet for long periods in the winter, for example, because there's just no soil structure, so the water just can't get into the soil, so it just sits on the surface. So it manages wet and it looks wet, but below that, when we're digging into it, it's dry. Yeah, so that means that when we do roll around to another sort of dry period, a drought, as we call them, but the rest of the world laughs when we use that statement to refer to a 6-week period without rain. But essentially, then there's very poor soil moisture available to drive production, essentially, and then moisture becomes a limiting factor. And what's really interesting is that actually, on paper at least, these longer sort of sunnier dry spells during the summer should be a massive opportunity. This is why the northwest of England in 2022 had their best year ever, because they had the elevated temperatures and they had the more cloudless days, and they had the little rain events every sort of 4 to 5 weeks just when it was getting dicey, and that meant the third cut came in, fourth cut came in, and they were sitting pretty basically. But again, the key point here is they had that yellow jail free card, they had the little rain events, which the east of England didn't. So as far north as York, essentially everything was burnt off, with the exception of herbal lays, just to sort of make that point, bring it back to the diversity piece, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and the rooting systems. Guy, as a horticulture producer and working with other horticulturists, I know it's been severe, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm just going to start with a little plug for the Wildlife Trust, actually, because I've been an organic farmer for 40 years, and that was largely about not using pesticides, I suppose, and synthetic fertilizers. And then about 10 years ago, Geety and I took on a 150-acre farm up the road from Riverford, having sold it into employee ownership. And one of the first things we did was to invite the Wildlife Trust, Lynn Kinderdine and Anna Davids, who we subsequently pinched from you, I'm afraid. And anyway, they just made me appreciate the richness underneath our feet, really, and really made, I think, both of us feel that our role as custodians of that farm, and that's what we, that was a really significant part of our farming. And I've always found the Wildlife Trust to be just so good at talking to farmers in language that they understand, and if you talk in that language and encourage them to value and see the stuff, which I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't seen a lot of these things, that is a tremendous motivator. So I really commend what you do.
Thank you for that.
But the impact of wilder weather has, it's all happening much, much faster than I think anyone expected. And we've had a couple of presentations from the Met Office, who are just up the road at Exeter. And there was one graph that showed to me that if you can be temperature, or it can be rainfall, but if you have an area that your crop is comfortable in, maybe a 5% change in the average can multiply the proportion that falls outside the tolerable zone by 5 times or something. So and I think that perhaps explains to me why it's happening so much faster. But the obvious things that we see are the unpredictable weather, the extremes, which have two real impacts. I mean, for us, it's largely about managing water and given that we are on up to 1 in 4 slopes, serious risk if you start getting water moving of soil loss. Great benefits in the last winter in that we didn't suffer waterlogging, but we've had to think very carefully, and we have had one catastrophic soil loss event, and we've had to take land out of production and put it into agroforestry and things like that. But the other great difficulty is it's crop losses. Obviously, there's no bloody margin in most things anyway. So you lose a crop, 1 crop out of 10, and that's any hope of profit gone for the year. But also the unpredictability of when you're going to pick it. I mean, everything that we grow and all the growers who work with Riverford, it's all programmed very precisely. That you'll produce 34 tons of broccoli in week 35 or something, and that's planned to go in certain sort of boxes, and all the calculations and the experience that we'd based up, therefore you had to plant this variety on that day. You can just tear it up and throw it away. I mean, the changes that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, just having to completely reevaluate planting dates and so on. So yeah, it's been catastrophic, and it's happening much, much more quickly than anyone expected.
That brings me on to the first thing I wanted to talk about is whether the farming sector as a whole is now clued into this. I mean, maybe it's a silly question. I do remember about 4 years ago, there was a letter in Farmers Weekly which was sort of decrying the idea of climate change, and it was not really happening, it's just weather. And it prompted me to do an opinion piece. And I got a bit of an attack, I got a bit of a, pushback, but Farmers Weekly were very clear and they understood it. But we're 4 years on now. Do you think there is enough recognition across all sectors that this is a major issue that needs urgent attention by them and everything that affects them? Can I start with you, Joe?
I mean, I think regardless of the industry you're talking about, or part of society, there's always going to be people who say climate change isn't happening. If it is happening, it's not man-made. If it is man-made, it's nothing to do with farming. If it is to do with farming, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. And anyway, China. There's always going to be kind of that flow chart. But no, I think the vast majority of farmers absolutely do appreciate that this is not normal. We are all, we at the Allerton project, and again, we have been focusing on climate resilience measures for at least a decade more. We are going to have £200,000 worth of lost income this year because, for the first time ever, we have not got those crops planted. So I think it's impossible really to be a farmer. We're across the world. We're on the front line of climate change. It impacts food production before it impacts any other part of the human economy, really. So I think this is absolutely something that the vast majority of farmers will absolutely be taking on board and realising that there is something that we have to do about this.
And you feel that there's been a change in the last couple of years? Yeah,
again, you're always going to get outliers, but I sense no significant whether farmers en masse think it's their responsibility to become net zero. We know how potentially fractious that argument can become. But there's absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, very, very widespread acceptance that climate change is happening. It's having a huge impact on individual farm businesses.
Do you all feel that, or do you think there's still an element of resistance?
Yeah, I completely agree that I think if you did that survey again 4 years later, I think you'd get a very big answer, different answer. I think the huge majority of farmers accept that it's here. I think there's much less agreement about what we should do about it, or indeed what we can do about it, given that most farmers have got their backs to the wall, and and the sort of long-term changes that are required, do require money that most farmers just don't have. You know, they don't have the luxury of looking 10 years ahead.
Maybe talk about the supply chain issues that leads us to think about. Do either of you want to comment about, have you experienced change in attitudes?
Well, I might choose this moment to just say I think perhaps the policymakers haven't done the sector any favours in that there hasn't been a very effective joining of the dots between climate mitigation and adaptation. So the Climate Change Committee, with my previous hat on, this time last year I was policy director at the Soil Association, and I was asked to be an expert reviewer on the Climate Change Committee's climate change risk assessment. And I saw my chief role. So this is there's a whole statutory process around adaptation, but it just doesn't have any teeth. It's not getting traction. I saw my role chiefly being about trying to suggest that the dots should be joined between the adaptation, the risk assessment around resilience and adaptation, and what has been set out in the 6th carbon budget as the climate mitigation pathway for farming and land use. Now, the risk assessment is saying the number one priority is to improve soil health, and meanwhile the mitigation pathway for land use and agriculture is saying, oh, soil carbon might be reversible, and actually a nod to agroforestry, good, but far too little emphasis on investing in soil health and in also reducing our reliance on nitrogen fertilizers to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Now, if they were joining the dots between adaptation priorities and mitigation priorities, then investing in soil health, investing in agroforestry, and supporting farmers to take those steps would be absolutely top of the list, a no-brainer. So, again, that's somewhere where we need them to be joining those dots very quickly. Instead, we get false solutions like biogas creating revenues for industrial livestock farms, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, diverting more land into producing energy crops. So, yeah, we need to make sure that we're joining the dots. It really helps the case for the agroecological pathway.
Absolutely, and why a lot of us are here with this Regen Summit, thinking about those things, absolutely. And it's great to see how Groundswell has grown. I think it reflects that understanding of building adaptation into the farm system, particularly with soil. Did you want to add to that? Okay. I was just going to ask, those 200 farmers that you sampled, were they all shocked, or were they expecting it?
No, none of them were expecting it, I would say, in general. If we would speak to that point, I think often it's the first time that they've really sort of engaged. And I think that maybe that's one of the sort of the key issues, is that often there's a feeling, and I'm wary in trying to sort of like speak for all farming or speak, for all the whole community. But my impression is that there's an impression on their part that the sort of the expertise around soils and stuff exists off farm.
It's elsewhere.
Yeah, that's the first thing. And the second thing, that whatever soil type you've got is just what you've got, and it's just some immutable substance that is just something you're blessed or cursed with, and it can't be changed, and therefore hasn't changed. And I think that probably is the key message, really.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it really is extraordinary. Going on to that, partly what you're saying, Joanne, about putting emphasis on mitigation and, things like energy crops and biogas from livestock systems. A lot of focus on that, and part of the pathways for the committee, those are in those pathways, so there's almost getting embedded into the system instead of thinking about adaptation. It hasn't got nearly enough attention. I've been working on the development of the ELMS in England, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and for several years, climate just wasn't in the room. It's extraordinary. And now it is, and it's getting a bit too much of the wrong kind of attention. But why do you think, what can we do about adaptation? Do you have any particular thoughts about why we're not getting adaptation and why it's not happening, and what we need to do to get adaptation on farm sorted, on every farm? Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah, Joe.
So, just to go back slightly on your point, originally soil wasn't anywhere near SFI either.
Yeah, this is true.
That was a big development when we managed to get recognition of soil in future farming policy, which was fantastic. I think from a farmer's point of view, Guy's already mentioned, ability to invest. Farming has had, for the most part, 30 very poor financial years. Let's be under no illusions. Farming in the post-war period up until sort of the mid-90s was almost a license to print money. It was a very profitable industry. It was. Since the mid-90s, there has been a series of factors: global commodification of supply chains, things like BSE, the rise of the supermarkets, which I would say have led to a huge decrease in the profitability within the farm gate. Farmers are always waiting for that next good year to be able to reinvest in their businesses. Now, that's whether we're talking about mitigation measures or whether we're talking about a new grain store. And again, I think most farms have an infrastructure problem, a drainage problem, many things that we would like to spend money on, but we do not have that long-term ability or stability within the farming system to be able to afford to do that. And that is a huge problem for long-term investment. But let's also not sort of shy away from the fact that, again, there's almost that inherent optimism with farmers that next year will be better. We all look forward, when we have a year like this, you look forward to harvest, you can clear away the horrible year you've just had, get back into the fields and have a reset. The problem is, I think that optimism that farmers often have and is bred into us over generations, I think is starting to no longer match the reality. The climate change is going to continue. Things are likely going to get more extreme. So for us to kind of hope that that was just an aberration this year, and maybe next year, we are going to be back to normal, and we don't need to worry about mitigation strategies in the absence of significant support in order to enact them. I think there's perhaps with many farmers, there's that kind of just fundamental hope that things are going to go back to how they were, which is just, it's very human, ultimately.
True. Joe?
I'd say that a huge priority has to be rolling out effective monitoring of soil health. So in Northern Ireland, we've seen the government fund a proper baseline in terms of soil health and soil organic matter. And here we've allowed ourselves to get into this circular bind where when the case is made for a legally binding soil health target, the excuse is rolled out that we don't have enough data. And when the case is made for funding for collecting the data, the excuse is rolled out that, well, we don't have a legally binding soil health target, so something else has to be a priority. And we've got to escape that. Having made that case to Daniel Zeichner a long time ago, and he was receptive at that point. Who knows? I don't think we'll get the legislation quickly, but I think the investment in rolling out that really effective measurement monitoring of soil health with a view to adaptation and mitigation, and also all the soil biodiversity benefits that will flow from that, absolutely key. Yeah. And then it's come up in a number of previous sessions, obviously. There's just so much for farmers to get their heads around, but with access to proper independent advice from people who understand agronomy as well as ecology and understand the soil, like Niels here, and my goodness, we could unlock cost-effective solutions. So that has to be an investment we should be making, I would say, out of the doubled ELMS budget that we're obviously advocating for as the Wildlife Trust.
Are you finding more farmers coming to the Trust for support? Since you started, I suppose it's quite short. But
we certainly are. I mean, it tends to be. Again, we are lucky enough to have some really well-facilitated farmer clusters in Wiltshire, and we are supporting them with a number of projects around, whether it's around species recovery or it's around nature-based projects for biodiversity net gain in the Bristol Avon catchment market, etc. But I do worry about the farmers that are falling through the cracks and the farmers that perhaps don't have the resources to be able to take a little bit of advice over here, a little bit of advice over there, and a little bit of advice over there. And particularly when it comes to new forms of green finance, you kind of need your legal advice. What we need is that one-stop shop that farmers can go to with people with that breadth of experience. That we need to make sure that the next generation of farm advisors, and we need them now, have those skill sets.
Yeah, it's certainly part of our campaign to get that advisory service available, independent advisory service. Adaptation, do you want to say anything? Oh, Guy.
I just wanted to know whether you would ever consider stepping into that role yourselves.
As advisors?
Yeah.
Well, we do. I mean, I've got a leaflet at the front to read about it with some... And Ian here, who put your hand up there, is coordinating that. And every trust has advisors, as you say. But yeah,
In
if you mean in
kind
terms
of more of an economic as well as an
economic.
ecological way. But
yeah, I think they're starting to do that in terms of looking at SFI, for instance, and all the options for farmers. But
I would
but
really
that's a lot.
welcome it. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Niels, did you want to say anything about adaptation? Have you noticed everybody shouting about mitigation, not adaptation?
Just remind me what adaptation is defined as.
Oh no,
What does
I've
it
got
mean?
hit top of my head. Being able to be resilient in the face of climate change and
Yeah.
adapt it to it, yes.
So I think the point I would make is that climate change is here, but what it's doing fundamentally is laying bare the systemic weaknesses in the farming practice or the farming systems. Essentially, for example, we used to have a get out of jail free card. It was called April showers. Yeah. Anyone old enough to remember them in the room? Well, they are a thing of the past. And essentially, a number of short rain events with spaces over a 5-week period will pretty much re-wet any soil. It's about the only type of sort of water introduction that will re-wet compacted soil, for example. So that essentially set up most of the spring cropping, most of the spring grass production, etc. But I think it's important to sort of separate this idea that, we've got to change now because it's climate change, which we do, but that it's only climate change. That also it sort of obfuscates from the root cause of the problem. And always want to be boiling it down to the essence. Why are these problems happening? Is it because of the weather? In general, it's not. The weather just shows us that our soils are in poor shape, for example, and that's why they drought off, and that's why they lie wet. So it's just another reason to go down, to invest and to inquire around soil health.
Great. So we've talked quite a bit about soil health, quite rightly, absolutely fundamental. What about other nature-based solutions? What do we need to be able to deliver the kind of adaptation that we want? What other, we talk about re-wetting peatlands and stuff like that, which means less food. There's a risk there, there's a conflict there, but there's agroforestry you've mentioned already. Do you see farmers embracing these kind of adaptation, nature-based solutions? Guy, did you want to go on that?
We have quite a well-developed supplier group at Riverford, and I would say at least 50% of them are pretty committed to sort of nature-based solutions. I mean, many of them are planting agroforestry, despite the fact, with a particular emphasis on nut production, despite the fact of how unproven it is in this country, and there's a huge amount of development work before you can say that it's an economically viable enterprise. But so a lot of them are embracing that with real enthusiasm. They're probably not representative farmers. The sort of people who work with us are not typical. In terms of the things that we're doing around, which is quite specialist, I'm talking about horticulture here, but it's about having control of weather again. So that means if it ain't going to rain, you build a reservoir and you set yourself up to irrigate, which is hugely expensive, especially when you have quite long rotations. And you have to, drainage can be important. I mean, on this, we in some ways, I'm going to say once that we're blessed with our slopes and that it hasn't been an issue for us this winter. We've got away very lightly. I mean, those figures about 40% not planted is just horrific. I mean, but drainage, sometimes irrigation, and then we're having to make a lot of things around, actually advised by Devon, I think it's catchment-sensitive farming, and have done quite a lot of work on the farm, and we have put in bunds around to make sure if we do get soil movement, it is trapped in the field and sediments in the field. Most of it, I'm still worried that we're losing the fines in that. Shorter rows, so there's less fetch, trying to keep it, not much more than 100 metres, taking the highest risk fields out of production, sometimes putting them into a agroforestry system with grazing animals underneath, and indeed just making sure that you're growing crops that are comfortably within their climatic zone. I have to say I was quite horrified to be at a talk just now where someone, a regenerative farmer apparently, was advocating growing grain maize in this country, which he must be using a plastic mulch to grow that, which is, I think it just makes the Environment Agency pull their hair out, and I didn't quite understand where his head was that you would be growing grain maize, not even in the south of Britain. Seemed pretty extraordinary. So I think the right crop in the right place is incredibly important. It's probably more important than a dogmatic following of local food, actually, I would say, in terms of protecting the environment.
Right. Joe, did you want to come in on adaptation? and particular nature-based approaches that you've tried?
So many of the things that Guy just mentioned, but what's also important to note is that nature-based solutions that will work very well in one circumstance won't necessarily work well in another, and that's why often when we're talking about more regenerative agriculture, the context is one of the key things that people mention. You've got your 5 key elements, but then also the context. And of course, regenerative, more sustainable solutions, they're a big grab bag of things. Yes, regenerative farming, I believe, works in every context, but it's the specific things that you choose. So, for example, you talked about sediment ponds. So we've done some research at the Allerton project that will demonstrate on a heavy clay soil, they're useless because the water is not in the sediment pond for long enough for the energy to drop out, for the sediment to drop out. But on a lighter, sandier, loamy soil type, they're really, really effective if the soil gets as far as essentially getting into your field drainage or your ditches. So as a last line of defence, great in some circumstances, useless in others. And it's having that nuance, which again is very difficult. And I think sort of just going back to what Neil said earlier on, as a farmer, I was a very conventional farmer. I had a very conventional setup back home. I didn't go to agricultural college. I did other things. I came back to the farm and I did what we'd always done. My father essentially doing what his father had done. And of course it generally is fathers. And then that's what I did. And I used to get incredibly defensive about the thought that anything that we were doing was not the best way to do it on our land. And it took some years before I started, perhaps some sort of innate natural curiosity. I was like, well, why is there 3 foot of soil at the base of that dry stone wall coming off that heavily cultivated slope? And then you just start to put a few things together. So it is essential that we do more of these mitigation measures, and there is so much that can be done. But again, and again, I think it's already been mentioned a little bit. I am of the opinion, however, that increasingly of the opinion that it almost doesn't matter how much mitigation we try to put into effect. If we're going to get winters like the winter we just had, no amount of mitigation is going to make the farm I'm currently working on a heavy clay land with quite steep slopes, being an arable cropping farm. Now, we can keep farming it, perhaps with agroforestry, diverse herbal lays and pastures, more livestock, which I always find quite ironic that perhaps we'll actually have to have more livestock in our landscapes in order to combat climate change and regenerate our soils. But I think some horticultural and arable situations, whether you're on really light soils or whether you're on really heavy soils, I really question whether we're going to be able to continue to farm them in that way, regardless of the amount of mitigation measures you throw at it, if the weather becomes as extreme as we're seeing now.
So just to round that off, you would need changes to your market if you're going to change what you're producing. This is one of the big things that I think is a gap in the understanding, because I think supermarkets and the food industry are very excited about carbon offsetting or measuring their carbon, measuring their scope 3 emissions and be able to shout to their customers about it. But are they really supporting farmers in, for instance, making the changes you think you might have to make, which are huge?
Well, Guy might be the best person to speak to that.
Sorry.
Well, I think you know what I'm going to say.
Go, say it anyway.
Yeah, well, obviously no. I mean, again, one of the other speakers was farming the Sainsbury's farm. Sainsbury's was the last supermarket that I used to sell lettuce to. And they were obviously doing some absolutely wonderful things. But it makes me wonder, why the bloody hell aren't you supporting other farmers to do this? It felt a bit like a vanity project, really. Make your money doing evil things and then, buy a place in heaven with a bit of offsetting. It made me feel quite uncomfortable, actually. The supermarkets have a hell of a lot. They've contributed hugely to the mess that British farming is in.
Yeah, and we need to invest in the kind of infrastructure and new supply chains if farmers are going to change what they're going to grow. Sorry, Joe, did you want to come on nature-based solutions? Because I know you've...
Yes.
Any other particular ones you want to cover?
Yeah, so a couple of things we'll pick up from what Guy's just said. You're talking about maize and the evils of maize, and I think there was a brilliant report by the Soil Association a long while ago called Runaway Maize, and it still stands. It is, I think, probably it should be the first priority for a new land use framework to make sure that there is any incentive that's supporting maize production, particularly on the banks of our rivers, is gone. And that's got to be for starters. talking about corporate villains. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of focus at the moment on water companies, and I guess in terms of a source of optimism and hope about where there might be more revenue streams coming for farmers around nature-based solutions. There is £96 billion over the next 5 years that will be spent by the water companies on their national environment programmes. So a lot of this will be, partly because of the campaigning pressure, going into engineered solutions for dealing with sewage outflows. There is a potential to divert a good portion of that into nature-based solutions. Now, that's 96 billion over 5 years. That dwarfs the 15 billion over the same period available from the farm budget. And we really need to be making sure that we're looking in the round at all these different pots of funding that are going to deal with different siloed problems. And if we join them up, then suddenly there's a meaningful incentive framework for managing our land differently.
That would be great, wouldn't it? And a land management and a land use strategy would help to do that. It wouldn't be the only thing, but it would help. We've got you want to come back on the maize, and you want to come back, and then we'll go to questions from the audience if you can prepare any questions.
I'm a bit of a stuck record on this maize thing. I mean, the Environment Agency absolutely pulling their hair out, locally on it. But you should be aware that in the southwest, I reckon almost 50% of it is grown through that clear plastic. Many of you have all seen the countryside going silver in our area. Anyway, right up onto the edges of Dartmoor, you should be aware that plastic is degradable. It is not compostable. You're using 80 kilos of this stuff a hectare, which will break down into microplastics. It is intentional pollution. And some of it you are paying for in your taxes, because some of that is going into green energy plants. So, I guess those of you lobbying, please, when you do these contracts, let's just think a little bit about some of the unforeseen, things that will come out of this. I mean, the maize, methane from maize is just completely insane.
Yeah. And, talking about food security, having 120,000 hectares over to energy crops. Joe, you want to come back on that?
Just on that particular issue and some other things that we could talk about in terms of where we are now with the food system, talk about intensive poultry production, for example. Now, farmers don't do these things because they woke up one morning and thought, what would be fantastic? Tens of thousands of chickens in a single shed, maize being grown under plastic or in the proximity of watercourses. The reasons farmers do these things are almost always financial, economic imperatives, because that's the way the food system has gone. Now, I'm not gonna stand here and sort of carte blanche, if you like, criticise the growing of maize, because ultimately it's an important part of many farms' business models. There are more sustainable ways of growing that crop. You can grow it in lower risk fields, on lower slopes with an understory, which means erosion during harvest can be reduced. There's a lot, as with anything, there's a lot we can do to reduce the environmental impact of, for example, maize production. Now, that's not, I completely agree, it is a very high risk crop. It can be a high risk crop for things like water quality and soil loss. But this is an area where an awful lot of work is, of course, being done in order to reduce its impact. So I get a bit uncomfortable in terms of sort of referring to what you said, Joanna, around we have to stop any support for that system. And I think as a farmer, sort of looking at things, try to be sort of pragmatically. Ultimately, farmers will do what the government and consumers ask of them. And if we want to have a completely different food system, we'll have a completely different food system, and farmers will provide that. I think. We just have to appreciate that it's that economic imperative which is always driving decisions which are being taken on farm.
Yeah,
Referring to the, sorry. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, take it in the context of farmers need a resilient and profitable pathway to regenerative agroecological farming. We need to shift those imperatives. We need to remove the perverse incentives, such as subsidy for maize going into green energy. And we need to make sure that there are proper incentives, be that the water industry budget alongside the funding that's available through green finance, through public money for public goods. It needs to work as a proper incentive framework for a whole farm approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I'm going to open it to the floor now. If you wait for the mic to come round. Don't know who's holding the mic. Thank you. Okay, this gentleman at the front. Thanks. Sorry, wait for the mic, because we're recording. Thanks.
In terms of soil health, as an upland farmer in Scotland, that doesn't seem, it's a struggle because instinctively you want your soil health to be a KPI, but how do you do it practically, and where will consensus end up on measuring your soil health, both in terms of scale? Do you do it every hectare, 10 hectare, 100 hectares, 1,000 hectares? And what should you be measuring? And my fear about it is if it becomes a crucial point to policy and grant money, then you could be, a farmer's self-interest might be, well, actually, I'll just do my test over there because it's better, or I'll do it in the weedy bit because it's worse. Where is consensus settling on the practical side of how to measure soil health?
Great. Niels, did you want to come on that?
Yeah, thanks. May I ask a little bit more details about your farm? Yeah.
Sheep and cattle in the Highlands of Scotland.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, I work with monitoring day to day, and I would say that it probably is the most important skill that a producer, manager, farmer can possess. And I would probably reframe the point slightly and say that I use and propose that farmers use monitoring to inform practice. So you can derive best practice on your own farm. You can answer those questions. Is my management practice moving us in the right direction or in the wrong direction? Yeah. So it will add value to your business through better decision making day to day. And it, by definition, is based on nature-based solutions. It just doesn't come from anywhere else, essentially. So by taking that approach, not only can you sort of road test and then roll out successful practices on your own farm, because you have that feedback, essentially. And in this case, specifically, I work with infiltration rate tests. I would say infiltration rate tests and spade tests is all you need to do. But you're doing it to settle your own mind that the intervention that you're doing is effective, and it will translate to better infiltration, more crumb structure, and that in turn translates to shorter housing periods, less drought effect, and essentially a more productive farm. And once you've gone down that route, then it's quite easy to report that. You know, you're already gathering that data because it has value to you, and it's just a very small step to then report it to some kind of statutory body, essentially. But essentially, if all you're doing is reporting to a statutory body and an end in its own right, then I don't think it's going to drive the change that you perhaps want to see, and it becomes something kind of redundant. You know, we're not. Again, the key point here: monitoring is not a means, not an end in its own right. Make it work for you, and then build on that.
And I did read that the 3 key carbon soil test, not just carbon, but soil testing organisations are going to harmonise their approach. I saw it in the carbon calculators, which is very helpful, I think, because you won't have to do 3 different, confusion about 3 different ways of carbon testing. That there'll be one harmonised way, which I think they're announcing today or this week. Joe, did you want to say?
On your specific question, I think my concern is just that most farmers don't have they don't have the level of understanding of soil that we might need in order to make these sorts of informed decisions. I've sat in rooms full of soil scientists, and it can divide directly down the middle and then sideways as well in terms of their opinions on what's the best way to measure soil health. You know, it's not a settled area, and again, practically, we do a lot of soil testing at the Allerton project, and my concern is that you can sample the same spot in the same field year after year, and the soil organic matter, if we're just taking that, can oscillate from 6% one year to 12% the next year to 4% the next year. There's a hell of a lot of points of failure in the soil testing process where bad data can creep in, a bad result can creep in, and it's hard to know what the reality actually is of that soil. And it's worth bearing in mind that if you take an amalgamated soil sample of your 10-hectare field, in the end, a couple of grams of that is going to actually be tested. You know, is that representative of your field? Whatever the metric it is that we're using. So I'd agree, we should be really incentivizing good practices that we know are going to be beneficial for soil health, but the actual practice of testing our soil is fraught with potential misrepresentation, I think. And then, of course, we get into a whole different story if we start talking about selling soil carbon, where that becomes just a whole nother level of complex, I would suggest.
Yeah. Okay. Is that okay?
It feels like keeping it simple. I mean, I think that, again, I talked about this bind earlier. I think we've made perhaps the perfect the enemy of the good, and good enough if you've got trying to keep it simple with looking at soil organic matter, looking at earthworm counts, etc. Even if it isn't turned into a pseudoscience which links it directly to an incentive payment, getting that baseline in place and getting the habit of farmers actually measuring and understanding their soil and what good looks like, and then being able to calibrate that back, associate that with particular practices that they're doing. It feels like that's still the very important direction of travel.
Yeah, you could say the same for beneficial insects and pest predators above ground. If you're monitoring them, knowing what the status is, that's another measurement. Guy, did you want to come? Any other questions? Oh, yeah,
just on the carbon thing. Every year I come here and I go around the stalls buying and selling carbon credits, and I just cannot believe the emperor's clothes. I mean, we've done this on our farm. You go and take it, slightly different place. You sell it to a different lab. You get a different result. How could people possibly be trading this? And biodiversity net gain credits, when I asked the people who were assessing them, I mean, that's a murky art as well. I mean, I don't know how can
Let's not get into biodiversity.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I just do. Anyway.
Yeah. Next question. Yes, I'm sure we'll be covering it in other sessions. Lady at the back there.
Hello, B. Oliver from Farming Wildlife Advisory Group, Southwest. So there's been a lot of talk about soil farmers managing and testing their soils. So I'm a host of a farmer cluster in the Upper Thames catchment, and I'm also the host of the catchment partnership. And so I've got access to a big group of organisations and a big group of farmers, and the kind of wherewithal to offer them free soil testing through the funding from the facilitation fund, farm cluster. So, and that's a luxury position to be in. And there are other farmer clusters who have got very hard-working facilitators who can access, get their groups of farmers together and say, look, we really want to get this testing, give us some funding. They apply for funding. But most farmers are not in those groups, and even if they are in those groups, it's kind of much easier said than done. So until we've got a wonderful situation like Northern Ireland where the government is saying, yes, let's fund baselining for everyone. What are farmers to do realistically when like a proper soil baselining costs £45 a hectare and they'll only do a minimum of 100 hectares?
Yeah, well, we should be asking for that soil baseline supported by government, but any responses to that?
I think back with when the Food Farming and Countryside Commission produced their very first report, one of the headline recommendations was that actually eligibility for accessing ELMS payments should rest on sharing soil data. Now, I think that given some of the technical challenges that, notwithstanding what we were saying about generally it being a good thing for farmers to understand how they can start to assess the condition of their soil, I think this links back to the question about the importance of governments funding independent farm advice, so that farmers can actually lean on farm advisors to be able to support them in that assessment too. Again, I think as we look forward, as I hope an incoming government takes another look at an environmental improvement plan and what is needed to achieve the Environment Act, it might be that it's time to look again at the case for independent farm advice as part of ELMS, part of an increased pot for ELMS.
Absolutely, and facilitators for clusters. I think they've been very successful. Anybody else? We do have to wrap up now, unless there's a very quick question. You did have his hand up very quickly with very quick answers, and that'll be it.
Okay.
Hope it's a positive one.
Thank you very much. A lot of good stuff spoken this afternoon. I'm Chris Clark. I'm one of the authors of the Less is More report and the Sweet Spot report. One of the measures you haven't really gone into is profitability on farm. 20% of farms do not cover their variable costs before support. 80% do not cover their variable and fixed costs pre-support. Support is 55 to 60% on average of farmers' incomes. We need to tackle that as part of nature recovery.
Yeah, I actually couldn't agree more. We really got to get that sorted. And it's a whole conversation about supply chain and where the money goes and whether it's really working, which I think we'd all agree it isn't really. It isn't working at all. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that in the context of wilder weather as a final comment, or anybody?
It's only going to get harder. You know, DEFRA's Health and Harmony consultation, its baseline period was the mid-teens. They said that only a quarter of farms were making money producing food. You know, very similar figures to what you just used there. That's clearly ludicrous. You know, American farmers, the most heavily subsidised farmers in the world, and they're going out of business at record rates. We do need more, in my opinion, you know, fairness in the supply chain. There's plenty of money there to help build resilience into the farms. We don't necessarily...
You know, the nutritious crop diversity that we need, rather than maize.
And we have a whole session on that tomorrow. Can you remind me what time, Barnaby? I'll get to you. 2 o'clock tomorrow with Chris, who did the Sweet Spot report with us. That's great. Niels.
Yeah.
11 o'clock. 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock.
Yeah.
So I'll just briefly respond with some data to Chris's point, and I think it comes back to management. It all comes back to management. So there's a report recently released, interim report from Rothamsted, showing that a change in grazing management practices can double stocking rates over set stocking. Double, yeah? Switching to species-rich pastures from straight ryegrasses doubles the yield, or otherwise matches yield on ryegrass with no nitrogen, yeah? So that's all your fertility costs out there. Significant increase in carrying capacity. When you add in agroforestry, for example, that's increasing productivity. It's shortening finishing dates. It's essentially every single metric in a production system. Grazing is improved with trees, for example.
Yeah.
And when we look at mechanical and mineral interventions, they're also like doubling infiltration rates, for example. They show positive gross margin impacts over a 4-year period, for example. Yeah. So by treating the cause rather than just throwing more solutions at the symptom, yeah, we will strip out the costs and unleash the potential that is in all our land.
On that note, thank you, Niels. If you're all right finishing there, Guy. Yeah, that's a great note to end on, and we need to look out for that Rothamsted work, which is really valuable. Thank you very much for sitting in the heat, listening to this, and many thanks. Can you give a round of applause to our speakers?